emerging infectious disease that has now reached outbreak proportions and likely pandemic proportions. If we get a major outbreak of this coronavirus in this country, that would mean perhaps closing schools temporarily, getting people to do more teleworking, canceling events where there is a lot of crowds in confined places, canceling unnecessary travel so that you're not on an airplane for 5 hours with a bunch of people who might be infected.
That would be a huge step. It would have enormous economic, societal, psychological implications.
It would, but it would be temporary, but it would be necessary.
Wow, a fascinating time capsule from 1 year ago today, guys. Dr. Anthony Fauci warning the nation what it was up against and what a year it has been. Willie, he predicted it to a T, and things got worse because of how badly things were run trying to counter the pandemic.
It's amazing, isn't it, to listen to that? That was 1 year ago today, and then you look down at the lower right side of your screen and see 516,000 Americans, more than that, have died because of this. And all the things Dr. Fauci said there, it was interesting. Richard had to introduce them, who Dr. Fauci was a year ago. Now he's become such a part of the furniture of our lives every day. But he's talking about school closings potentially, canceling events, maybe some teleworking. Here we are now, a year later, shut down.
Look at us.
And in the meantime, we've passed all these other anniversaries where former President Trump said it was going to disappear, that it was one person coming in from China. So while people like Dr. Fauci were sounding the alarm a year ago, we were still getting from the top of our government the message that it was going to be okay if we just closed our eyes and let it disappear.
Well, you know, and just to put things in proper perspective, because I know February, March, April seem to be a blur to so many of us. Dr. Fauci said that on March the 2nd. I believe it was in February where Bob Woodward had sat down with Donald Trump, who already was saying this was going to be a killer virus. It was going to affect the old and the young. It was 5 times as bad as the flu, that it was really deadly and a big problem. And it was actually more than a month before that Joe Biden wrote an op-ed in the USA Today. And in that op-ed, he said, we are not prepared for the pandemic. And the president would do well to listen to his scientists and his doctors, of course, talking about then President Donald Trump. And that just never happened. And Willie, the consequences are really, it's hard to fathom.
It is. You know, if we pass the $500,000 death mark, 500,000 mark a few days ago, and remember we sat here and said, a year ago, there was some talk of 100,000, maybe 240,000 deaths on the high end, and that seemed unthinkable, impossible. And now we've marched well past 500,000 deaths. So our lives have been completely upended, and it takes a moment like that to watch that a year ago. It's hard to even remember a time when we were speculating that schools might have to close for a short period of time. Maybe some events would be canceled. Since then, Mika, businesses have closed, children have lost a year of education, people have lost loved ones. It has completely changed this country over the year since that interview took place.
It really has. Along with Joe, Willie, and me, we have Rogers Chair in the American Presidency at Vanderbilt University, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian John Meacham. He occasionally unofficially advises President Joe Biden. And we have a lot to get to this morning. On the virus, the first doses of Johnson & Johnson's vaccine are rolling out across the country. As the CDC director warns, it's not time to ease up on restrictions yet. Social distancing and mask wearing. The Senate is expected to vote this week on President Biden's coronavirus relief bill, a bill that is among the most popular bills in decades. We'll show you the numbers on that. Also this morning, a third woman has come forward with a harassment allegation against New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, and now some Democrats are calling for him to resign. Also, U.S. sanctions on Russia are expected as early as today. We're going to get the new reporting on that. But, Joe, a lot to get to because, you know, I thought it was so interesting over the weekend, the CPAC event and former President Trump's speech. It was almost like he walked off the stage and, like, he became invisible again. Everything sort of fell flat. I don't think he got the reaction that he wanted. And all the discussions that we have about the party and the impact that he's having on the party, it's also sort of interesting to watch just general reaction to him. I'm just not seeing it.
Well, I've got to say, getting reporting a day later, he wasn't pleased with the speech. He went the first hour on teleprompter, but he was inside. Somebody there described it as it's almost like a sound check for a band. You're inside this big hall.
Yeah.
It's a third full, and that's because of COVID. It's not in Washington. It's down in Orlando. And the whole thing seemed very small to him. And he was irritated.
So he didn't get the reaction he wanted.
He didn't get the reaction he wanted. And then after an hour, he went off script. And when he went off script, that's when he really started churning up the conspiracy theories, which upset people there, upset his people there who thought he really needed to stay away from the conspiracy theories. So all in all, it didn't go well. And then, of course, Mika, I saw last night the Wall Street Journal opinion page, who we've been following very closely because at times they've seemed far too, well, they've kowtowed to Donald Trump at times. But there have been other times where they've drawn a line in the sand and been very tough. And it certainly seems like this morning's op-ed is one of those times where, I mean, wisely enough, it's like they've had enough. And I've got to say, Democrats and people in the media wring their hands when Donald Trump comes out now. We talked about it yesterday. And the Wall Street Journal is saying, and I think they may be right, that actually Donald Trump, when he comes out, is something Democrats should cheer about because he's genuinely bad for their party. And this editorial, let's read a little bit of the editorial, Mika. This editorial, I think, really it has to be the must read, especially for Republicans on Capitol Hill today.
Yeah. OK, so it's entitled "The Grievances of Trump Past," in which they ask, if he was so great politically for the GOP, why is the party now out of power? And the board writes in part this: Mr. Trump said Sunday that he won't form a third party because it would divide the center-right coalition and elect Democrats. But he also laid out his political enemies list and is clearly bent on revenge against anyone who voted to impeach or convict him or disagrees with his election claims. These intra-party fights will sap GOP energy and resources when their priority now should be retaking Congress in 2022. Mr. Trump's base of support means he will play an important role in the GOP, but as the Biden months roll on and the policy consequences of the 2020 defeat become stark, perhaps the party's grassroots will begin to look past the Trump era to a new generation of potential standard bearers. As long as Republicans focus on grievances of Trump past, they won't be a governing majority. So, yeah. Joe, what they're saying is Trump equals losing.
Well, he does. I mean, they're the party of grievance. And as the Wall Street Journal said, the party of grievance past. And I want you to compare the Democratic Party right now with the Republican Party right now. You have the Democratic Party that lined up behind a candidate. You're looking like, let's talk about Bernie Sanders and AOC. They lined up behind a candidate, Joe Biden, who, as AOC said, in any other country would be in another party from her. Very little in common. They consider Joe Biden to be a relic from a different age ideologically, Democratic Party past. And yet, what did they do? They worked around the clock to get him elected. You talk to Biden people off the record, they will tell you that Bernie Sanders worked hard as anybody to get them elected. AOC worked hard as well. Other progressives who disagreed with Joe Biden on a lot of issues. And even now, Democrats are trying to figure out how to come together, from Bernie Sanders to Joe Manchin, to pass a bill that actually 76% of Americans support. And the Republican Party is opposing that bill. The Democratic Party is acting, and I know Republicans understand this on the Hill. The Democratic Party right now is acting like a governing majority. They're acting like a party that wants to pass legislation, who wants to make a difference, who wants to advance their causes that are near and dear to them. And guess what? They're willing to compromise, even with Joe Manchin, even with Bernie Sanders. They want to move the ball down the field. And then you have the Republican Party that has turned into a party of gestures, empty gestures, and grievance.
Anger.
This is not a contest. This is not close. The Republican Party, unless they actually read the Wall Street Journal editorial today and take it to heart and figure out how to start being constructive and understand. I said this yesterday. This is so important. Understand that this is not 2009. The battlefield's always changing. You lose by fighting the last war. That's the old saying. Joe Biden is not Barack Obama. You can't just obstruct in 2021 and think you're going to get the same results you got from 2009 to 2016. It's not going to work. They're going to pass legislation. They're going to run over you. They're going to run around you. They're going to run through you all day because they know what you did in 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2000. They understand. They understand that even when Donald Trump got elected, you hardly passed any landmark legislation. You passed a tax cut, yes. Good for you. Good for you. You made tech billionaires even richer. You made sure that Amazon paid zero in taxes. You made sure that all the people you claim to hate made billions and billions and billions of dollars during this COVID crisis while working class Americans and middle class Americans were suffering so badly. So, yeah, you did that. And, of course, Donald Trump, as you know, went down to Mar-a-Lago and bragged to his billionaire friends, I made you all a lot richer tonight. So, yeah, you got that. OK, great. So that's the one thing you've done legislatively since 2009. It's not going to cut it. And so the rest is just grievance. It's you guys going up, you Ivy League boys going up, attacking Ivy League schools. It's Ted Cruz going up, attacking parties of country clubs when Ted Cruz is worshiping a guy. It's really sad. It's really weak and pathetic, but he's continued to worship a guy politically who actually lives in his own country club and spent a lot of his presidency in his own country clubs that he owned. And John Meacham, there's a part of this that I just think cuts to the quick. Republicans lost the House in 2018 as suburban voters fled to check Mr. Trump. He proceeded to lose the White House on November 3rd, and he cost the GOP 2 Georgia Senate races on January 5th. As he made his claims of election fraud the main issue rather than checking Mr. Biden and Nancy Pelosi. Mr. Trump essentially told Georgia supporters that their votes didn't matter, and they stayed home. So the GOP lost the Senate. Mr. Trump, says the Wall Street Journal editorial page, is now trying to rewrite this history as someone else's fault. Democrats who cheated, Republicans who won't, quote, fight a cowardly Supreme Court that includes 3 of his appointees. Anybody but himself. This isn't true, as another Trump pollster, Anthony Fabrizio, made clear in his post-election analysis. Mr. Trump had one landmark victory in 2016, but he has cost the GOP dearly since. Well, John Meacham, and the famous words of Harry Truman after he got off a train and a guy screamed at him for 10 minutes and said that if he were the last man on earth, he would never vote for Harry Truman. Truman said, I'll mark you down as undecided then, and walked on. So let's mark the Wall Street Journal editorial page down as undecided here. But they're telling a truth that I don't think even Democrats understand right now, which is Trump at this point is actually good for them building their majorities.
Perhaps. To me, there are a couple of divisions, just looking at this clinically, in the broad Trump coalition. Right. You don't get to 74 million people with just the readers of the Wall Street Journal editorial page or just the MAGA folks that you saw in Orlando and beyond. It's this fusion of a couple of different things. And one of the things that I think has been puzzling to a lot of us who have followed and in some ways admired the Republican Party of Eisenhower and Reagan and the Bushes is that what is it about the culture of grievance, the populist, demagogic, self-evidently cult of personality, Trump appeal that's going to get you, the 35, 40% perhaps. That Joe McCarthy had 35% of the country after he was censured. You can get 40% of the country to say almost anything. But where that 10 to 12%, and I'm not sure what the millions would be in the 74 million people who voted for Donald Trump, pointing out that 81 million people voted for Joe Biden. It's the people you and I know, that you and I like, who were McCain Republicans, were Romney Republicans, were Jeb Bush Republicans, until all of a sudden Donald Trump becomes the nominee. And then they may not be all in culturally, but they're all in when it matters, which is voting. And then these have to be some of the folks who are saying Joe Biden wasn't a legitimately elected president. Because what you usually get is an undercount of a Trump poll, right? So you're getting more than 50% of Republicans saying, oh, Biden's not the real president. That's not just the paranoid style in American politics people. Those are people we talk to and know. And so what I'm wondering is, let's not outrun the evidence. I think, to quote our friend Michael Beschloss, we remain in a national emergency about the durability of democracy.
Joe, one of the concerns I've heard from Republicans, the kind that John's talking about, John McCain Republicans, George W. Bush, Reagan Republicans, that we all know, is that even if Donald Trump doesn't run again, even if he's pushed to the side and forgotten in some ways over the next few years, it's all the mini Trumps who are coming up through the system, having learned a lesson that the way to get elected, the way to become president of the United States in Trump's case, is to be seen as fighting constantly, to be in a perpetual state of combat, not to get mired down in policy discussions and debates in the Senate, but to always be aggrieved, to always be seen as fighting. And we see that with people like Ted Cruz, but also with a bunch of freshman members who've come in this year, too.
Yeah, no, I understand that. And I think I'm in the distinct minority when I say this. I don't think Trumpism is transferable as a national message, only because after 8 years of Ronald Reagan, Republicans were sure that they were going to be able to extend Reaganism over the next decade as far as continuing to win the White House. After Reagan and Bush, what is it? The Democrats have won 7 of 8 popular votes starting in 1992. Obamaism, the Obama coalition that we heard was the new rising coalition that was going to forever dominate American politics in 2008. That was not transferable either. Bill Clinton, his success was not transferable. So I'm just not sure, Mika, if there's another person that wrote a book in the 1980s about success when he was the biggest loser in the history of the United States, according to the IRS, lost more money than anybody else. And then had a celebrity show after he went bankrupt about 20 times, I exaggerate, in casinos.
Yeah.
Like in Atlantic City, and then ran for president. Josh Hawley can't pull that off. Like Ted Cruz barely beat Beto O'Rourke in Texas a couple of years ago. And I don't see it as being transferable. I may be very naive. I do believe, though, that what the past 4 years have shown is that I've been very naive as it pertains to the threats to democracy. I agree with what John Meacham said, what
Yeah.
Michael Beschloss said. We need to remain vigilant because we have seen over the past 4 years the very real challenges to our constitutional republic and what we need to be on guard for as we move forward through the 21st century.
Yeah, and you mentioned AOC, being for Biden, even though she was as far away within the party as possible, and Ted Cruz being a poser for Trump. AOC was working for Texas when Ted Cruz was out of Texas in Cancun, and it's not a low blow. My point is that Democrats are working on their issues, like them or not, and they're performing public service, doing their jobs. I don't know what these Republicans are doing. They're angry, they're undermining, and they're always lying. They're trying to sort of adopt the Trump mythology, but it's not working as much, or maybe it won't. But the worry in me is that, Trump got by everybody.
Yeah, but the thing is, Willie, Trump, when Trump went out on stage, and still the same, obviously, I said he's like, with no disrespect to the king, he's like Elvis in the final year.
Yeah.
Like, he's doing everything but
In the
like
jumpsuit.
lazily throwing the scarf off into the audience. It's really
seem like
all
that.
sweaty.
Sort of, yeah. No, I mean,
but I will say Trump was able to fill stadiums. Trump was able to fill arenas. Trump,
like it or not.
Trump. One thing we never said about Donald Trump is he needs acting lessons.
Yeah.
But because people believed him.
Right.
It was all a lie. It was all BS. But you look at Ted Cruz. I'm so glad you weren't here yesterday, Willie. You were spared of watching Ted Cruz as Mel Gibson. It was awful.
Oh, I saw it.
Oh, my God. It was horrible. And Josh Hawley, I am doggone it. I am being censored.
Well,
poor me. I'm so weak. I went to Yale,
Cruz joking
and then I
about
went to
Cancun.
Stanford, and poor me. It's really, these guys.
Terrible.
You look at them, you're like, I do want us to consider starting a GoFundMe site for their acting lessons because they're so bad. But we say that just to say, again, what Donald Trump was able to do in 2016 before he lost every election after that.
Yeah.
None of these other people can do, and they just look like clowns when they try.
And so many people have looked like clowns over the years. Remember during the 2016 campaign when Marco Rubio tried the Trump Act for a couple of days?
Yes.
It just doesn't work unless you're Donald Trump. And Donald Trump could fill those stadiums, and he could fly in on his plane and dip his wings in Mobile, Alabama, and pack the place. None of these other guys can do that. But they're trying. And they're trying to get in the way right now of COVID relief. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer announced yesterday the Senate will take up the COVID relief plan for passage this week. The House version passed over the weekend with the $15 minimum wage in it. But Senate Majority Whip Dick Durbin says the Senate Democrats will not overrule the parliamentarian who ruled the measure was not permissible under the rules of budget reconciliation. NBC News reports the Senate parliamentarian will allow pension plan protection and assistance with paying COBRA premiums to remain in the bill. Let's bring in author of the Washington Post early morning newsletter, Power Up, Jacqueline Alemany, and data journalist for The Economist, Elliot Morris. Good morning to you both. Jackie, let me start with you. So how is this going to roll out this week? Are they going to peel off the $15 minimum wage and then pass it through reconciliation with just Democratic votes?
It's a really good question, Willie, and that's still something that's up in the air. We know that Chairman of the Budget Committee, Senator Bernie Sanders, is pushing this minimum wage provision despite the Senate parliamentarians ruling that it can't be protected by budget reconciliation. But overruling the Senate parliamentarian would be quite dramatic and something that the White House has said that they are against. That being said, Senator Sanders said he's going to raise it as an amendment essentially daring people like Senator Joe Manchin, who have said that they don't want to overrule the parliamentarian, to vote on the $15 minimum wage hike in the vote-a-rama that's going to begin as the Senate begins to debate this final COVID package. But look, the White House has also said that they are against overruling the Senate parliamentarian. When you had Republicans fire Bob Dove, the parliamentarian in 2001, people described it to me as a pretty shocking situation that was almost unprecedented. It's hard to imagine Democrats doing it, but you have progressives and people like Sanders and Senator Warren pressing this ahead, calling for, one, overruling the parliamentarian, or two, eliminating the filibuster.
So, Jackie, if you've got powerful senators like Senator Warren and Senator Sanders saying this has to be in, or at least we have to pass this by some other means, where does that leave the White House? What do they say to Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren?
Yeah, it's unclear what that debate looks like internally right now. But from a public perspective, we just have both sides sticking with their, their proclamations that they're not budging either way. But right now, as it stands, Democrats don't really have a way forward of delivering a signature policy proposal that they've been promising of hiking the minimum wage because it doesn't. Congress doesn't have the votes. Democratic senators don't have the votes on the Republican side to pass this as a standalone bill because, senators haven't agreed to, senators like Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema haven't agreed to eliminate the filibuster. It's unclear who's going to budge here. The White House so far has done a pretty good job at accommodating the progressive leftist flank on these sorts of provisions. Perhaps they'll budge on a different provision here, like increasing unemployment insurance, extending it a month or two. But that's something that we're going to see play out on the Hill starting today.
Boy, Elliot, you look at the polling on this. I know you've been studying it. This is one of the most popular pieces of legislation we've seen in a long time. Obviously, it helps people get back on their feet in many ways. It pushes us closer to getting schools reopened. Whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, there's obviously something in here for you.
That's right. And I should say we compared this polling data just to sources from Chris Warshaw, a political scientist at George Washington University. And we found that on average of the polls that have asked support for the COVID relief bill, that about 70% of Americans, as high as 76%, depending on the poll, support Biden and Democrats' measures. And that's higher even than the support that the 2007 minimum wage hike or 2009 minimum wage hike got. That's higher support than any of Donald Trump's legislation from past 5 years. And this is really a staggeringly popular bill. Americans want, might argue they need relief. And so we have to also ask the questions of why this isn't being expedited in the Senate, what sort of institutional barriers could be stalling the progress.
Yeah, John Meacham, it's fascinating that Republicans are all lined up against this. I understand some of those concerns that actually I've had over the past 4 years, and none of them have had, I don't think, which is I don't think it's as focused as it should be. I think they could probably get by with about $1 trillion less in this $2 trillion bill. But again, the national debt's not something the Trump Republicans have worried about at all. So they're really stopped from complaining about it now. But you do sit and wonder, how does this party, if they're willing to bow and scrape to Donald Trump for 4 years, how does this party turn their backs on one of the most popular bills in, my gosh, the past 50 years, a bill that 76% of Americans support and a majority of Republicans support? Is this once again the Republican Party playing off of an old playbook?
I think so. I think they're going to call it socialism, even though they've already voted for similar stuff. There's going to be a kind of functional, weaponized cynicism about this. And you're going to have, because this bill is popular, because it is part of a Biden new administration push to vaccinate the country, to try to stop to try to soften the economic pain that so many people are feeling, I think that even they are capable of seeing the logic that if a Democratic president successfully vaccinates us and successfully ameliorates the difficulties that so many people are facing, he's going to have a case to take to the people for other things he wants to do. Right? It's not simply walking into a ballroom and yapping about it. It's not simply tweeting about it. It's not simply pushing a culture of grievance and victimhood. One of the great ironies in our political life is that a party that disdains victimhood has embraced it. Right? They are victims of big tech. They are victims.
God, yeah.
It's just on and on and on. And I somewhat parenthetically, I think I didn't see a lot of attention paid to it. His comments about the Supreme Court and the courts from Sunday are incredibly revealing, because one of the ways the Republic survived, and that's not hyperbole, it's not hyperbole. One of the ways the Republic survived is that one of the three branches of the Constitution, laid out in the Constitution, did the right thing. And that was the courts. And we haven't paid a lot of attention to it. And here's how, what an awful time we're in. I even hesitate to say it. But the courts played their constitutional role at a moment when the president was not. He was self-evidently and actively undermining the Democratic Republic. And he had so many allies in Congress who were willing to do it with him. And so I don't want to go so far as to say the Supreme Court saved America, but it came pretty damn close. Imagine what would have happened if they had granted cert to one of those cases and somehow or another in a 5-4 decision, they refused to certify the electors from Pennsylvania. The whole thing falls apart, I bet. The whole thing.
You know, I really think one of the unwritten stories of the past year, and I also, we talked about it actually, John, before, other than the fact that Jim Clyburn was probably the man who moved history more than anybody else in 2020 for reasons that really should be self-evident to everyone. He had as much to do with Donald Trump losing than anybody else. But as far as holding the line for this constitutional republic, there has to be one day a story written, a book written, and not just about the United States Supreme Court and what they did, the line they held during the 2020 election, but the entire federal court system. And not just at the end, but you can go all the way back to February of 2017 when a Washington state judge put an injunction on, I believe it was Trump's so-called Muslim ban. And Donald Trump challenged that Bush-appointed judge, called him a so-called judge, questioned his integrity. Immediately, federal judges, whether they were liberals, whether they were Federalist Society judges, all understood at that moment that the independence of the federal judiciary was at risk, and they acted accordingly over the next 4 years. And it is an extraordinary story. Our constitutional republic survived so many of the challenges, and if you believe, like I do, that things could have gone extraordinarily badly, and we could have lost the democracy that we came to recognize, John, I think we those of us who believe that owe federal judges of all stripes a great debt of gratitude.
Federal judges, absolutely. It's like there's some heroes in the civil rights era, right? Of these white Democratic appointed district judges who were brave in the maelstrom. The other is the secretaries of state, the state officials, the election officials who stood up to remarkable political pressure. And we talk so much about what goes wrong, understandably, but this is a case where, the Constitution only works if there's human agency and a kind of often unseen but clearly felt devotion to it. And those folks who were guardians of the democracy, and I don't mean to be overly grand about it, but watching him again the other day, I thought, God Almighty, we came so close, and here blessedly, I feel guilty bringing all this up again, because blessedly you're talking about the COVID relief bill. We're talking about vaccines. You're showing Fauci. We're actually governing a big, complicated, disputatious, multi-ethnic, diverse country again. But that force that almost wrecked us and that sent people into the Capitol is not going away. It's a perennial force. It ebbs and it flows. And it flowed during the Trump years. And God willing, we're done with the Trump years. But I don't think anybody who's concerned about the future of democracy, the future of our prosperity, the future of what has made us a more perfect union can afford to rest.
All right, Jon Meacham, that was actually not boring at all. Thank you for that. Also, data journalist for The Economist, Elliot Morris, and The Washington Post, Jacqueline Alemany. Thank you both for your reporting and your analysis this morning. Now to multiple sources telling NBC News that the U.S. and European Union are expected to impose coordinated sanctions on Russia as early as today. The sanctions come after the poisoning of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny and his arrest and detention that followed, and will be the first to target Moscow since Biden became president, when he opened a comprehensive review of U.S.-Russia policy, including the Kremlin's actions against Navalny, interference into the U.S. election, the SolarWinds hack, and reported bounties offered to Taliban-linked groups to target U.S. forces in Afghanistan. That's a lot that's been happening over the past few years. Let's bring in White House correspondent for Politico and MSNBC contributor Natasha Bertrand, who's been following all of this. Natasha, good to have you back on the show. Tell us the latest with the sanctions and on Navalny.
Yeah, so we are expecting them as soon as today. There's going to be kind of more discussions among White House officials about how to roll this out in coordination with the European Union. Now, this is something that they had been discussing since Biden came into office. They were doing this massive Russia review, and they were trying to figure out the best way to penalize Russia for its human rights abuses, of course, poisoning Alexei Navalny, the espionage campaign that targeted so many federal agencies in the United States, and the reports that Russians were putting bounties on American troops' heads in Afghanistan. So what's happening now is there was actually a package, a sanctions package left by the Trump administration for the Biden administration that never got passed at the end of the former president's last couple days in office. And they've been deciding whether or not to use parts of that sanctions package or whether to just, kind of reestablish their own parameters for penalizing Russia. It looks like they wanted this to be more multilateral. They wanted to work more with the European Union on this, and that's what we're going to see this week. But it is an important first step in the Biden administration's plans to hold Russia accountable for these malign activities.
Natasha, obviously Putin had gotten very comfortable over the last 4 years under Donald Trump, knowing there weren't going to be many consequences for his actions, and we see now why he worked so hard